Let's go. And congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, we made it. We are now at the halfway mark of our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge, week number 22 out of 44. And of course, it stands to reason if you're watching these videos live. We're not only halfway through our challenge, but we're also, well, halfway through the calendar year. So a very big, happy new financial year to those of you to whom that applies. Well, last week, as we discussed, we saw a monumental shift in the story of God's people, where the nation of Israel that had become the kingdom of Israel has now become a divided kingdom, with the kingdom of Judah in the south, the tribe of Judah essentially, as well as Benjamin and the Levites, centered there in Jerusalem, the kingdom of Judah, where in the north we have the renamed, or they've taken the name, the kingdom of Israel, which are essentially the 10 remaining tribes, the 10 northern tribes, okay, with the capital city established being Samaria. They're led by different kings now and different tribes. Pretty well they've all had bad kings up in the north, and that certainly continues this week. Down south, there's a bit of a mixed bag of good kings and bad kings, and again, that kind of also continues this week. But what we need to get used to, and this week particularly, again, is that back and forth narrative, where something's happening in the north, something's happening in the south. And while this king becomes king of the north, this king is ruling in down south in Judah. That's how we have to now understand the Bible story as we move forward. All right, so this week we're going to see that back and forth narrative continue. We're going to read the first 15 chapters of 2nd Kings, which again, like 1st Kings, because it's really just the one book. Remember, Kings is only ever one book really. Focuses on both kingdoms, so that's going to be back and forth, back and forth. Chronicles, we're only reading 4 chapters there this week. Again, that focuses just on, or primarily on, Judah. They're mainly interested in the line of David. They're in Jerusalem, in Judah, so Chronicles focuses there. We're also going to read another prophet, Jonah, who's similar to Obadiah last week. Is a very small book. You can easily read him in one sitting. And also, like Obadiah, prophesies not primarily, well, not at all actually, to God's people. His ministry is to a foreign nation. We'll see that in the Book of Jonah this week. And we're also going to get a head start, can you believe it, on a major prophet, Isaiah. A huge book. We're going to be spending 4 weeks on him, mainly because his ministry spans about 60 years. Okay, so in the chronology of things, Isaiah is not only a big book, but he's a major player and ministers during the reigns of a number of different kings in that area. We're going to be spending 4 weeks on him, get a little start this week with just 6 chapters. Okay, so that's what we're doing. Let's have a look at the narrative before we take a look at Jonah and then Isaiah. So, narrative this week. As I said, same as last week, Kings and Chronicles. Now, I warned you last week that the back and forth can be a little bit confusing, and it's made even worse this week by the fact that some of the kings have the same name. All right, there's a guy in Israel and a guy in Judah. They share the same name. There's also another Jeroboam this week. You think, haven't we had one? Yes, well, it's Jeroboam the second. They're just taking the same name. It's like John or Mark. By the time you get to the New Testament, they're just common names. So that can make it even more confusing. As I said last week, despite the fact I've made some oversights on the years, I don't know how that happened, please use this chart that I've given you as part of your reading plan, just to help you keep track of the kings in the north and the south as you go. Okay, so a reminder to use that. Well, last week in 1st Kings, as we finished off those chapters 12 to 22, we covered 4 kings in Judah and 7 up in Israel, whereas Chronicles, you might have noticed, we covered 7 in Judah. So we actually read ahead in Chronicles last week. 7 kings, including, which is basically 6 kings plus a queen mother. Okay, so when we read Chronicles, we got ahead a little bit in Judah. This week, as we head into 2 Kings, the first 15 chapters, we're going to cover 7 more kings, including the queen mother down there in Judah, and 11 more kings in Israel. All right, we're going to go through 11 kings up north this week. So basically, at the end of this week, we'll be up to king number 11 in Judah and king number 18 up north. All right, so that's how far we're progressing basically in the story. We're going to find a lot of political intrigue, conspiracy, coups, and assassinations. There's a heck of a lot of them this week. I really enjoyed that. There's a great deal of strife is also between the two kingdoms that are sometimes battling each other. Sometimes they team up and battle outside nations. There's a lot of battles with outside nations. There's cities destroyed. There's cities under siege. There's a whole lot of warfare and stuff that goes on this week. Down south, again, there's a mix of good kings, bad bad kings. There's some really good kings that start great, but end pretty badly, a bit like Solomon, okay? Starts really good, but doesn't end so well. Up north, as I said before, they're pretty well all bad. They do all evil in the eyes of the Lord, with the possible exception of one king called Jehu, who is basically God favors him because he kills a bunch of kings. He ends up pushing Jezebel, Queen Jezebel, off the wall of a city so the dogs can lick her bones. I mean, it's just great stuff. And apparently God likes that idea and gives him 4 generations of leaders there up in Israel. So Jehu might be an exception. As I said, take note, up here in Israel, this is really key, the kings go in between tribes, or tribes vie for power. All right, so there's different kings from different families up in the north, the 11 kings this week. Down south, it's always David's family, and I might say something a little bit about that later. All right, the other thing that gets a really big mention this week are the ministry of the prophets, mainly because there's a lot of idolatry going on. So anytime God's people are worshipping idols, in come the prophets. The big ones, of course, like we saw last week, are Elijah and now Elisha. Okay, so this week we see Elijah hand over to Elisha with all his miracles. In fact, I think it's the first 10 chapters of 2 Kings. Elisha is actually the main character. All right, so you're going to focus a lot on him in your readings in 2 Kings this week. But then there are another couple of prophets that get a mention this week, and they are Jonah and Isaiah. You will literally read about them in Kings, and then we're going to go and read their books. All right, so let's have a little word about those. The book of Jonah is a classic. Most everyone knows the story of Jonah and the whale, okay? Well, listen, it's 4 brief chapters. You must read it in one sitting, okay? Like Obadiah, just sit down and swallow it whole, no pun intended, all right? Don't vomit it back up again. Just swallow it whole, sorry. Swallow Jonah whole. Read it in one sitting. Jonah is obviously a true historical figure. There's a lot of debate about, is Jonah a fable or a fairy tale or whatever? Well, you know, as we see in the narrative, he is a real historical figure, but you do have to admit that the style of the book is written very much in the genre of satire or parody. Okay, you are supposed to laugh out loud when you read Jonah. The original audience would have done that. It's written to be satirical, to take something that's serious and ham it up, okay? Exaggerate things that deal with typecasting and that type of thing. So it's meant to ham up a story. You're supposed to laugh when you read the book of Jonah. And like Obadiah last week, Jonah's ministry is targeted mainly or exclusively to an outside nation. And I make the point of saying that because that's not the case with almost all the other books of the prophets, okay? Almost all the prophets deal with either one of the 2 kingdoms, God's kingdoms, the kingdoms of Israel, Judah and Israel. Obadiah and Jonah have ministry to outsiders, which this week, as we find out, or you may know already, is basically the city of Nineveh. Now, at this stage, Nineveh is just one city in the nation of Assyria. 50 years later, after Jonah, it'll become the capital, but not quite yet. All right, it's in the nation of Assyria. And at this time in history, Assyria isn't particularly strong. Its strength grows and wanes. They're up north, okay? It grows and wanes over time. When Jonah is prophesying, Israel up north is actually very strong. They're in a really strong position. They've got a long-term king up there at this stage. They're doing quite well militarily and in prosperity. And Assyria are a little weak. So it's during that time Jonah travels up north, or is supposed to travel up north to go to Nineveh. All right, so that's the ministry there. Enjoy Jonah, and I won't say too much more about that. You can do your own research if that interests you. Which brings us to Isaiah. Isaiah is our first major prophet, and he's a major prophet basically because his book's really big, okay? But also, as I suggested before, he prophesies over decades, multiple decades basically, during the reigns of a number of kings. And so because we're spending a whole month in Isaiah, I'll say more about him in coming weeks. But one thing I will say again and again that I'll just make a point of today is that you do need to pay attention to the audience Isaiah is speaking to, okay, and any time statements. So the audience and the time that he is speaking. This week, he is predominantly speaking to the south, to Judah and Jerusalem, but for the first 5 chapters, there are no time statements. Okay, we don't know exactly when these prophecies in the whole of Isaiah's 60 years of history, when they were given. We know they were given down south, but when they were given, we're not too sure. But they're still good to read anyway, because they will give, at this point in Isaiah, right at the start, because they will really give us a feel for Isaiah. And in fact, many of the other prophets, basically, get used to this, the Old Testament prophets, when they speak to God's people, whether it's south or north, are basically all doom and gloom, with little bits of hints of hope. All right, that's how I like to describe it. Doom and gloom with hints of hope. You'll see that as you read these prophecies in the first 5 chapters of Isaiah. And then in chapter 6, by the way, he'll mention his first timestamp. When the king Uzziah died, that's when his ministry began. So it seems like these first 5 chapters, those first 5 prophecies, are sort of put at the start of the book, even though we don't know where they are. Okay, I'll just leave that with you. Couple of things I really picked up this week that I'd love you to just pay attention to as you read. So a bit of a Sunday school lesson here as we close off this video, okay? Basically, the one thing I want you to take home, or the one thing that really stood out to me this week, is that God is faithful to his covenant promises. God is faithful to his covenant promises. And essentially, there are 3 major covenants that we see in play at this time of God's people, this time of Israel's history. All right. Firstly, the covenant of Moses. God is faithful to that covenant. Remember at Sinai, even though God's people are now split into 2 groups, they are both still under the covenant of Moses, where if you do good, I will bless you. But if you do bad, I, Yahweh says, will curse you. And just like in the era of Moses, one of the things you're going to see this week is when God's people are disobedient, people are struck with leprosy. Fire burns them. Cities are laid siege to by foreign armies that come and invade. God is behind it. All right, God is assisting or causing these foreign armies to come and attack his own people, because that's exactly what he prophesied back in Deuteronomy to Moses. Okay, we even see the fulfillment of a prophecy where there was a lady in one city who, it says, was eating her own children. Okay, these 2 ladies eating their children. Why did they do that? Well, they were so desperate, the city was being laid siege to. But another reason is because that is one thing that is specifically mentioned by Moses at the end of Deuteronomy. It's part of the curse of the covenant law. God is faithful to his covenant promises, and he's faithful to his covenant curses for those in this covenant that disobey him. All right, so that's the first covenant, the covenant of Moses. The second covenant God is faithful to is the covenant of Abraham, which predates Moses, of course. And we see this in the narrative this week when God is judging, particularly the northern kingdom, who are gone right off track. They are really disobeying the covenant of Moses. But God says to them, I'm not going to wipe you off the face of the earth quite yet, okay? And he says, the reason I'm not going to is because you're children of Abraham. God extends mercy to the north. Mercy, mercy, mercy to the 10 northern tribes. Why? Because even though they deserve judgment because of Moses, they are still under the Abrahamic covenant, and God is keeping faithful to Abraham at this point in time to the northern tribes. The third covenant we see that's in play relates specifically to the south, and that is the covenant of David. Okay, so Moses applies to both of them. Abraham applies to both of them, but he uses that this week to the north. But thirdly, the covenant of David, which only applies to the south. And that is where God said to David, you are always going to have a son of yours on this throne. Okay, the throne in Jerusalem will be occupied with a Davidic king. That's why up north, all different types of families take the throne. Down south, even when there's not a male king on the throne for a period, all right, when the evil queen mother is on the throne, there is still a baby locked away, hidden for 6 years, a son of David who will come and take that throne from the evil queen mother. All right, so even then, God is faithful to that covenant. And that's my point. God is faithful to his covenant. The blessings and the curses, just like he said he will be, God is faithful. And the second thing to take note of is that really captured me again reading through these passages this week is the parallels of the prophets, the prophetic characters, to a future great and glorious prophet that is to come. Think about it. This week, Elijah, the prophet, is taken up into heaven with his body not seeing decay. Who does that remind you of that ascended into heaven at some point in the future. Elisha performs many, many, many miracles. He's one of the greatest miracle workers of the Old Testament. He raises a widow's son to life. He feeds 100 people with just a couple of loaves of bread. Who does that remind you of? Who's coming into the future? And then, of course, there's Jonah, who spends 3 days and 3 nights basically dead, buried in the depths of the sea, but is raised back to life and preaches to a city that needs to repent, or it will be judged in a period of 40 days. Well, who does that remind you of? A great prophet that is to come. You see, no matter how complicated the Old Testament may seem, how convoluted or confusing or somehow irrelevant these Old Testament stories may seem, somehow they all point to the great prophet that is coming. They all point to Jesus. So I hope that you see him this week. No matter how confusing the Bible is, try to discover him. The historical intended meaning, yes, but also discover him. Discover Jesus. I hope you do that this week. All right, guys, bless you. Well done for reaching the halfway mark. I'll see you next week for week number 23. Bye.